So right before we get started, so first, thanks for a Thursday afternoon making the walk up here, getting out of Moscone. Appreciate that. So this is going to be a whirlwind. I have a tremendous amount to talk about. If you've ever seen me talk before, you know that I can ramble with the best of them. And I'm going to probably put that to shame today, though focused rambling. So let me just go ahead and get started. This session is going to be on an open source Apex class library that we released in March called Sirono-common. I'm Scott Wells. I am the CTO for a company called Sirono. That's one of the hats that I wear. That's the one I'm representing today in this session. I'm also the developer of the Illuminated Cloud IDE for Salesforce. So just real quick, I do want to just comment on who Sirono is. Sirono is an ISV that I went to work for about a year ago. I've actually been in the ISV space for about 8 years now. Worked with this guy right down here for the previous 7 years. Sirono is in the healthcare space. Our applications, we have several of them. They're all 100% native Salesforce. Applications are for healthcare revenue cycle management. Really what that means is payment collections. So there's a back office application that's a Service Cloud console that a hospital would use to manage payments and payment plans and things like case logging and call campaigns, things like that. Then there's an end user facing for the patients and the guarantors, the people that hold the insurance policies, to be able to go out and make payments, set up recurring payment plans, things like that. And of course, like any good application, there's always an analytics suite in order to do backward and forward-looking analytics. So what is Sirono-common? Well, back in March, I don't know if any of you guys know about Good Day Sir. They have a Slack channel. It's a great resource for the Salesforce developer community. There was a discussion, actually a question was thrown out about trigger handler frameworks and if anyone could recommend one. We have a very lightweight one we put into place. A lot of them are a little bit heavier than I would have wanted. So we put a very simple one into place, and there was an interest in having access to it. So I ran up the flagpole whether we could go and open source it. Answer was yes. Turned out we had quite a few other things that we could open source that I think would be useful to the community. In fact, quite a few of them were things that I had built in my previous life. And once you've built something twice, you never want to have to build it again, right? So if we could put it out there and just have access to it, that'd be great. It's available under the Apache 2.0 license, so it's non-viral, and it's available in GitHub. The people that I work with, we are traditionally Java developers. We came from that background. There's been some Python, some Node, things like that, but primarily Java. So the components of this library are heavily influenced by Java libraries. Some standard, some third-party, Apache Commons, Guava, things like that. You'll see those similarities as we go through it. The themes of the library, the problems they're intended to solve at a high level, you'll see the details in a moment, but at a high level, the problems they're intended to solve: make the code that you write safer. Avoid things like null pointer exceptions, or have to write a lot of boilerplate code to avoid null pointer exceptions. Make your code more concise. I'm not concise, but make the code more concise. Be able to express the intent of the code in less code, especially if it's something that you're doing in an idiomatic way, repeated. And to make the code more expressive. If you look at the code, you should be able to very quickly understand what it's doing and why it's doing it, and sometimes it's not obvious, especially if the second one doesn't hold true and the intent of the code's not concise. So these are the overarching themes. Hopefully you'll see that as we go through them. So what does it include? We're actually going to exhaustively go through all but the first bullet, all but the last bullet. So I'm not actually going to call those out individually. It will be redundant. I do want to point out that one of the things it does include is documentation in two forms. The GitHub repo has a wiki, and the wiki has been kept up to date with exactly what the different features are, how you'd use them, the problems they solve, in some cases the philosophy behind the approach that was taken. And then additionally, they're extensively internally documented using Apex doc. So if you use an IDE like Illuminated Cloud or some of the other IDEs that support Apex doc, you actually get integrated API documentation. You can also go generate kind of standalone documentation if you want. All right, so that's all the preface I wanted to do, so let's just kind of take a look at it. In the past, when I do demos, I typically actually do a lot of demoing. There's not going to be any hands-on demoing here, simply because this is a very, very dense session in terms of time and content. What I am going to do is talk about each major set of functionality in the library, and then I'm going to show you code samples and just let you understand why it's there and the problem it solves in more detail. And I think the one that I want to start with is the trigger handler framework. So the trigger handler framework, again, is what motivated the release of this library, the creation of this library. There are a lot of trigger handler frameworks out there. I'm not going to advocate ours as being dramatically better than any of the others. I'll just talk about why it exists and how it's a little bit different and why it solves the problem we have. The first thing is if you're familiar with this, it basically implements two of the main best practices around triggers in Apex. One of them is that you should not register more than one trigger for the same object and event combination because there's no order of execution that's guaranteed. So especially if there are dependencies, you can find yourself in trouble. The second one is that you really don't want to put any of the logic in the trigger itself. It makes it harder to test. You have to start some type of a DML event to actually instrument that logic. Instead, what you want to do is get out of the trigger as soon as possible and into Apex code where you can go and do fun things like testing and mocking and things like that. So it implements both of those. There's very little code to implement. Again, it's intended to be lightweight. Obviously, you have to write the trigger. I'm going to show an example of each one of these in a moment. You have to write the trigger. It's one line of code in the trigger body just to get the dispatcher to send it to the right place. You do implement a factory. I'll show you in just a minute why, but I believe very heavily in strong typing. I don't like to deal with a bunch of objects and you're casting at the last second. And anything you can catch at compile time, I want to catch at compile time, or ideally in the IDE. I don't want to have to find things at runtime if I can avoid that. So strong typing is extremely important to me. So the trigger handler factory allows you to take collections of arbitrary S objects and get them into strongly typed collections so that you can work with them in your actual business logic. And then you actually implement the trigger handler. And the trigger handler itself, as you'll see in a minute, is exactly what you'd expect. It gives you the ability to go and override selective methods for a combination of timing, before or after, and whatever the DML event is, upsert, insert, delete, undelete, whatever it happens to be. Those are all interfaces, or rather trigger handler factory and trigger handler interfaces. I recommend that you subclass abstract trigger handler because it includes a lot of additional functionality, including some utility methods to do things like get a value reflectively off of an object, off of an S object, or more importantly, ask if it's changed if you're doing update context. Has the value for this changed in a single expressive, concise way? And then similarly, you can ask, has the value been set? Has it been set from non-null to null? Null to non-null, rather. So here's an example of it. Is the code readable? That's good. That'd be a real pain if it wasn't. So the trigger at the top, as promised, is a one-liner. We include in the library trigger handler dispatcher. You just call a class method dispatch, and you give it the class constant of your factory. That's it. And it takes care of the rest. And then here's what your factory would look like. One thing I want to show here is, since Apex doesn't have namespaces, what I mean by that is in the sense that like Java has packages and C# has namespaces, a lexical scoping mechanism outside of packaging. You want to avoid polluting the top level namespace. And so because this factory is only ever used in the context of this trigger handler, I always recommend making it an inner class. Obviously it needs to be public in order to be able to use, but it needs to be, I advise it be an inner class. But you can see, again, it's very simple. It gets passed by the dispatcher. The new state, the latest state of the objects is a list, just S objects, and the previous state, if appropriate, as a map keyed by ID. It's the same stuff you would get out of the trigger context, except the idea is you really should never have to consult the trigger context in this framework. All right, and then you just basically instantiate and return your trigger handler. And so here's what that looks like. I know you can't read this one, so we're going to actually do some zooming. So first thing you need to do is you need to either implement trigger handler or extend abstract trigger handler. And then what you want to do with your, notice it's a private constructor. There's no reason this would ever be called by anything other than your trigger handler factor. And if your trigger handler factory is an inner class, you have valid encapsulation there. Encapsulation is obviously important, right? So you can see that there are member variables that are your strongly typed collections of new and old state. So all you do in your constructors, you just assign those. There's an interesting behavior of Apex that you can actually do an uncast assignment from a list of S objects, raw S object to typed S objects. So I don't have to do a cast there, but of course from the map I actually do have to have a cast. So that would be just how you get your trigger handler to be basically in the world. And now let's take a look at how you can implement functionality. All you have to do is just override the methods from the interface. You're actually implementing from the interface, but if you extend the base class, there are default implementations. So if you don't need it, you don't have to go do anything with it if you're extending rather than implementing. And all you do is just override the appropriate method. Again, you can see we have member variables that are strongly typed, so you don't have to do any casting at this point. You can walk through them. Before insert's pretty straightforward. Before update, you can see that we're taking advantage of one of those methods from the base class. Field value changed. Again, expressive and concise. So if we basically have some contacts, see if the birth date changed on a contact. I work for a healthcare company. There are times when a person is no longer considered a minor or something like that. We have to check for those states, and that actually changes the behavior. We're not allowed to call their parents if something happened or something like that. So these types of checks are pretty normal. So you can override exactly what you want. So the trigger handler framework, lightweight. There's no additional filtering or anything here like you would see in other frameworks. We actually do have intermediate base classes that do other things like check. We have what are called system managed fields where they can only be set by our own trigger logic. And so we have some other intermediate base classes. You can inject your own functionality as you want into the type hierarchy, but by default, it doesn't try to become a kitchen sink. This is what it does. So that's the trigger handler framework. So moving on to the next theme, and there will be two sections of this. This library, again, it's not a framework where everything kind of hangs together. It's more of a grab bag, but it's an organized grab bag. So the next set of this is going to be based on collections. So collections, I imagine you use them all the time in Apex, right? It's hard to get anything done if you don't use the collections. Especially when you have to bulkify things, going back to the trigger logic. Out of the box, Apex includes 3 collection types. Lists/arrays are basically interchangeable in Apex, so ordered collections of elements. Sets, unique unordered collections of elements, and maps, basically associative arrays or key value pairs. Well, what is a multi-map? Pretty simple. It's a multi-valued map. And this is really useful when you're doing something like partitioning data. Think about querying back a whole bunch of contacts and you want to partition them by the governing account. Or think about things with a master detail relationship and you want to go and partition things by the master record and find all the details for them. It's a common thing you do, and if you're doing bulkification all the time, you're probably doing this all the time. To a large extent, this is syntactic sugar sitting on top of the out-of-the-box map, because you could do this as a map where the value parameter is one of those 2 collection types. However, you lose encapsulation in terms of you always have to go out and get take a key, get the value for it, see if it's null. If it's null, you have to initialize it, put it back into the map. You get rid of that boilerplate this way. That's the pro. Again, is concise and expressive. The con is you can't do user-defined parameterized types in Apex. This has come up in half the sessions I've been in that everyone Chris Peterson's been in. That doesn't exist yet, so as a result, these are untyped. I said I don't like casting, but I do like the conciseness and expressiveness this provides. So I think it's a decent trade-off, and I'll show you in a minute how other aspects of the library provide the ability to very quickly provide strongly typed keys and values. One thing I will point out is that the storage backing for a multi-map, there are 2 ways that you can do it. You'll notice at the top it says multi-map new set instance. There's no public constructor for this class. There are factory methods to create a set-backed multi-map if your values are unique and order doesn't matter. Or you can do list-based storage, in which case the values order of insertion is important, the retention of that, and duplicates are allowed. So create a new multi-map. This is the example I just gave. Go out and query contacts, query the contact ID and the governing account ID, and then basically start to partition. Do a put value, and it'll actually partition those for you. And you can see how I can iterate across those. Notice that the key set is going to return a collection of objects. I immediately cast, and I'll show you how we can do this a little bit better in a minute, immediately cast that to strong typing. Then I use it to get the values, which are a collection now. You don't ever have to worry about null coming back. If that key has never been inserted, you'll get back a non-null collection of the right type. So again, you're not going to get an MPE at runtime if you just go out and start enumerating across that. That is completely safe code right there. And then you can cast that and you can start dealing with your account contact pairs. Very, very handy. So that's one aspect of the collection-oriented behavior of this library. The second one is collection util. And if you've ever used Google Guava, if you've ever used Apache Commons Collections or something like that, you've probably used something identical to this. It gives you the ability to manipulate the various collection types. Now, one thing I will point out, there's a bug in Apex. I've already reported it to Salesforce. It does not respect polymorphic behavior based on parameter types. So that means that you cannot take for set or map. It does for list. So a lot of things are implemented for list, and some of those are not implemented currently for set or map. It frustrates the crap out of me because I always want to go out and use my is empty, is not empty when I have a set and it's not there. Actually, it's there, but it's commented out. I'm just waiting for them to fix it. But they know about this now. I'm hoping it's a really simple thing for them to fix. So I've broken this out into the categories of behavior that this particular class provides. Null safe access, I've brought this a couple of times. Have you ever heard about the $1 billion mistake? Null? It's actually, this is one link. Pretty well documented. You may know that newer languages like Swift and things like that, and even Java with optional and things like that, try to avoid the problem of null. It's been there forever. It is considered the $1 billion mistake simply because NPEs account for a huge proportion of runtime errors. They're never going to go away. I mean, the fact is that the lack of a value as a valid value is just the truth of the nature, right? You can put lipstick on it and call it an optional, but the fact is it's still there. But it is an expensive thing. So the more that you can avoid that, the better. Salesforce did us a favor a little bit back by on the string class, putting a bunch of class methods to say whether a string is empty or blank or things like that. Did the same thing here for collections. So you can go out and do things like collection util is not empty. By the way, again, going to expressive, it has both is empty and is not empty. Yes, one is a Boolean inversion of the other, but if you've ever done that, of one that only had that one, you try to go look at whether the bang is sitting in front of it or not, it's hard to figure out what it's trying to express without looking at it very closely. So we were very explicit in terms of the method signatures here. You can also see you have the ability to copy one list into another, only extracting the non-null elements. And if the list on the right side was null, it'd be fine. If the list contained null elements, it would be fine. Again, you shouldn't have to worry about that. Normally, you'd have to write all this if not null. If the list is not null, then you can go across. Now, if the element's not null, copy it. It becomes a one-liner. And similarly, at the bottom, the ability to extract boundary elements. This is really useful if you're running a SQL query and you only want one item from it. And how many times have you done that and you assign it to one element and 0 elements come back and you get an exception, no rows for assignment, right? Exception handling is not flow control. I don't know why they did that. I hate that. And similarly, if you get more than one row back, typically you put a limit 1 on that query. But if you get more than one row back, it bombs the other way. So the way around that is you query back into a list, you check whether the list has an element, is non-null and has an element, and you extract that element if it does, right? Very easy way to do it. Collection util get first item. If the list is null or empty, it'll return a null. Otherwise, it'll return your first item, and all you got to do is cast it. You get it. Similar, get last item if you're doing like last in, first out type of behavior, just a really easy way to do it. So null safe access. Data type conversion. This is really important with MultiMap, but we've had plenty of other places where we need to convert, for example, a list of strings to IDs, and technically you can do that, but we just want to take the whole collection and turn it into a more strongly typed collection, right? There's a couple different ways that you can do this. We have a very specific one for IDs, 2 IDs, and you just hand it a list of objects, whatever they happen to be, and it'll give you back a list of IDs. Obviously, if the elements in that aren't IDs, you're going to get a class cast exception. But for the most part, you know what you're dealing with. You just need to put it in the right form and use it. The other way you can do this is you can take an entire list of widely typed objects, like object or something like that, or S object, and you can convert it into a narrow typed list of objects. You do have to hand it a prototype of the list. Actually, not a prototype, it's what it'll populate. So you can see in the next to last line, 2 type list. You give the list that you want to convert, and then you give it an empty list, and it populates that in place. You technically don't have to capture the return value, but we also return it, so you could use that to go out and do, for example, iteration immediately on it, which is really great with those multi-maps. So you can just go out and say, get the values for this, turn it into this type list, and do a for each on that. One line of code. So conversion. Slicing and extraction. How many times have you queried something from the database and all you cared about was the value of one field for each row to go put it somewhere? So this is, again, a one-liner. You can go out and say, I want to get all the IDs of this. You can do that by putting it into a map and pulling the key set. You can also do it now just by saying collection util get IDs. You can also get that as a set. You can get it as a set or a list, depending upon what you want. Obviously, if you may have duplicates and you want to compress that, really good to go ahead and get it as a set. Another thing that's really handy is the ability to map by ID field. So this shows the example of, for all the opportunities, go and map by contract. That's only safe if there's a one-to-one correspondence there. If there's not, we will throw an exception. We don't want to be ambiguous and you end up getting the last one that had that contract ID. It would actually throw an exception saying that it would be a duplicate entry. You see the last line, multi-map by field. That's the way you'd actually do it if you want to go out and basically partition a list of S objects by the values of one of the fields on all those S objects. Very easy to do it, and you just go work with that partition. And again, for bulkification, that's really easy. In between those two, you can see map by field. The ID ones, you can see that the key into it is an ID. This actually allows you to go and map by any field of any type, but the keys have to be objects, just the nature of it. But it would allow you to slice by dates, things like that. Comparator-based sorting. This was a discussion that came up a few months ago. So out of the box, the list class has a sort method on it. It doesn't take any parameters. And basically what it does is if the elements in the list implement comparable, then it will order them based on the implementation of comparable. If not, it will use natural ordering. That's probably correct sometimes. If you need to do more complex ordering, if you need to do one-off ordering, maybe you want to sort these contacts by this field here, but by this set of fields over here, you can't do that easily in Apex. Well, most other languages in their libraries have a notion of a comparator, which comparable, the interface that comes with Apex, basically says compare me to this other object. Compare this to this other object. Comparator says, here's two objects, go and decide what their lexicographic ordering, whatever it happens to be, is. And just like comparable has a compare function, just like its compare function, you return a negative value if the first one should be ordered before the second one, parameter. You return a positive value if the opposite is true, if basically you want to take the first parameter and order it after. And you return 0 if they're considered equivalent. And so effectively, you're able to implement the comparator interface, and then there's a collection util.sort. Now, we didn't want to have people go out, including ourselves, and write a whole bunch of these that are identical. So we went ahead and created comparators, basically a set of these that already exist, that are singletons, that you can use for doing any type of ordering against all the primitive types, so strings, all the numeric values, date, date time, all that kind of stuff, and S objects based on a field. And all of these have a Fluent style API, so then you can specify the order of sorting, whether it's ascending or descending, and where nulls should go. So if you've ever done an order by clause in SOQL, you can express that same thing when you ask these standard comparators to sort. So you can see here, we're taking a set, we queried contacts, and we want to go and sort those contacts by their birth date descending with nulls at the end. This is really important if you use Shield platform encryption. We just started using it. We've got PHI data, very sensitive. We get in trouble with HIPAA if we didn't encrypt that at rest. And once you start encrypting fields, you become very limited, even with deterministic encryption, as to what you can do in terms of ordering and filtering in a query. So this allows us to go out and run the query and then put things in the correct order, for example, for presentation. So really handy for those types of things. And you can see down here a primitive-oriented version of this. We're going to go and sort contact names by their strings. We're going to go sort them. But whereas I could just do list.sort, I want to do this a case-insensitive sort, and I couldn't do that otherwise. So it allows us to just go out and do a case-insensitive sort. And here's how you would implement a custom one. There are no lambdas or functions or inline functions or anonymous interclasses yet. I look forward to the day when there are. So for the moment, these have to be standalone classes, but when I say standalone, they can be, again, interclasses. Don't pollute your root namespace unless you want to reuse that. And even then, I would do what we did, and that is, if you have a bunch of them, nest them inside some type of contact comparators class or something like that to have some type of lexical scoping. So all you do is implement comparator, take that method, and I just described the behavior of it. All this does is takes a name, a composite object that has multiple components, and sorts. Basically, does a primary sort on last name, case insensitive, and a secondary sort on first name. And you can see that you can use composition and delegation. You can just go and get our comparators and use that string comparator in order to do that. So that's great. You build up your library of comparators, you can start using them within one another to get really powerful, one-off, ad hoc, very focused ability to sort lists in memory. By the way, the sort is not QSort implemented in Apex and really inefficient. What it does is it puts an adapter in place and actually calls list.sort. With a comparable interface that delegates to the comparator. So it should be as efficient as the underlying Java implementation of the sort. Some of these other ones I've seen in the past implement their own. And that's fine, but especially back when you had a maximum number of statements that you could execute, you sometimes couldn't sort a collection. So that kind of finishes up, by the way, the collection-oriented aspects of this. Let me make sure that we're tracking well. Oh, wow, I am flying. Authorization utilities. So we're an ISV. We need to pass security review. We need to make sure that that we check every query, every DML operation to make sure that it's protected. We're also dealing with PHI and PCI data, so it's even more important. Actually, I'm less concerned about security review than I am about HIPAA coming down on us and telling us that we've screwed up sensitive customer data. The fines will be tremendous. So there's three different aspects to CRUD FLS, or rather I should say to authorization. You've got CRUD, basically create, read, update, delete, FLS, field level security, and of course sharing, row level security. This library only includes facilities for doing the CRUD aspect of that right now. And so I'll show you how that works. It has two different approaches to it, check style and assert style. Use check style when there's basically a path for recovery. If the user's not allowed to do this, go implement some other logic, go follow some other logic path. And then assert. If the user's not able to do this, throw an exception, let it boil, basically back out the stack, probably the presentation tier, grab the details about why they weren't able to do it, and show the user. The latter for us is easily 95%. We do assert style, because we basically have a data access layer, a business logic layer, and a presentation tier, and at that presentation tier we capture that and show it to the user. We have the data access layer just says, sorry, I can't do this, we're done. There are a few exceptions to that where we actually recover. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So we'll start with the check style example. So there's an authorization util class, and you just call is whatever the thing you care about. Accessible, if you want to know if they have read access to it, is updatable, creatable, upsertable, things like that. And you pass it, again, I want to know if things are going to fail at compile time, so you pass the class constant for the basically the S-object identifier. So you pass that, and it will in the underlying, it will check, is that non-null? Does the user have access? You can chain these together. So basically, does this user have access to both contact and account? Because we're about to run a query on contact doing a join to account. So you need to make sure that both are okay. If they do, we're going to do some updates. So now go see if the contact's updatable before we go and make the updates and do an update statement. So that's properly guarded. You might even move the is updatable before. There's no point in querying them if you can't update them, since that was the whole point of that. But in this case, you also degrade gracefully. It's hard to say what degrade gracefully is here. What would the alternative path be? That's why this is not the most common usage of it. So then we do the assertion style example, which you just basically put as the authorization util assert accessible. Instead of is, you just do assert. You pass the S-object compile time constant, and if that bombs out, it's going to throw an authorization exception. As I mentioned before, your try-catch wouldn't be this closely nested in terms of the call stack. I showed it because that's how you would recover from it, but it would really be several layers out in the call stack, likely as close as possible to the glass in terms of the presentation tier. So do this, and it will definitely help you both with protecting the code the way that you should, but also with security review. Very important. Next class of functionality, test assertions. Apex includes 3 methods for doing test assertions. I think everybody's probably seen these. Assert that a state is true. Assert that an actual value matches an expected value. Assert that an actual value does not match an expected value. The funny thing is those last 2 aren't really needed. You can express everything with just a Boolean expression. You can basically, all you need is system.assert, but there's things you lose with that. One, you lose the reporting that says, automatic reporting says, I expected this, this is the actual, if you do that, because you're doing that comparison yourself. You also lose, again, that expression of the intent of the check in the method signature, or in the method name. Well, it turns out that if you've ever used things like JUnit or TestNG or things like that, there are a lot of other types of checks you can do that, again, make it very clear the type of thing that you're checking for beyond just saying system.assert. I mean, the one that I think was driving me crazy is the equivalent of, is the value null? And I go do assert equals null, comma. I really am just asking, is this value null? So what we did is we implemented something very similar to what you'd find in those other frameworks. And some of these are just pass-throughs, as you can see. Assert.isTrue is system.assert. It's pass-through. But what it does is that in the assert equals not equals is it allows us to have homogeneity of what we use. You don't end up with, in the same test method, some system.assert and some assert.is something. You have homogeneity. The downside of that is some of the static code analyzers, like check marks and things, will now say, you have a test method with no assert, right? So just if you have to do that and you give a response in a security review, just say, take a look at what this calls, and you'll see that I have a ton of asserts. They're just indirect, right? So basically, is true, is false, same type of thing. One could be the Boolean inversion of the other, but that's not clear. I don't want to have to go look at that. And all these, by the way, can take an optional message as well, of course. Equals, not equals, is null, is not null. Assert.fail. Has anyone ever basically tried to do this? You go out and basically just system.assert false. The most often usage of that is you expect to catch an exception and you don't want to go to the next line. I see all kinds of nodding, that's great. And so system.assert false makes me feel like I need a shower. I don't like that. That sounds terrible. So assert.fail, just basically right here, I'm failing, I put a message that says I expected to have this type of exception at this point and I didn't, right? And it's very clear. We also have some very Salesforce specific ones here that have to do with when exceptions are thrown, which is kind of the corollary to the thing I just said. I expected an exception to be thrown. Now, what exception was thrown is what I expected, and does it have the details I expect? Has exception message. So basically, hand it an exception, see if it has a message. Hopefully you're using labels. Custom labels do that. It's not hard-coded strings on both sides of it. It's all referring to the same thing. Has DML exception message, 2 different versions of it. This is really useful if you use validation rules on the declarative side, or if on the program, basically the the Apex side, if you have like pre-trigger logic that goes out and does add error at the header level or at the field level, you end up with a DML exception. And that DML exception has a bunch of details in it about what was attributed with what type of an error. You can basically just say, does this field, again, it's a field constant, compile time constant, was it tagged with this message and you just hand it the DML exception, or did this object get tagged with this message? And again, hopefully using constants there, or label references into your message catalog. And has page message. So if you're doing something in Visual Force, or sometimes not even in Visual Force, where you're filling your page messages to be shown in Apex page messages component or something like that, you can go out and just ask, does this field have this page message attributed to it? So again, the type of thing that gives you a lot of confidence that what you expected to happen happened, instead of did I catch a DML exception and move on. But doing it without having to write all that boilerplate code, you have to go get the DML field and now go get the error off of it and all that stuff. Enums. So Apex has three different Apex data types in terms of custom data types: classes, state and behavior; interfaces, contracts; enums, ordered lists of symbolic constants. Enums in Apex are extremely simple. All they can have is a symbolic constant, and it generates an ordinal for you. Sometimes you want more than that. So that's what type-safe enum takes care of. If you've ever worked with type-safe enums before Java added more complex enums, it's almost identical. And it's very similar to just type-safe or to standard enums in Java. Picklist enums. This is where you actually have a constrained domain of values in your metadata that you almost certainly are referring to from your Apex to set values, to check whether a value for a Picklist field is a given value, things like that. And there's no symbolic constant for it. They don't generate that for you. And so hopefully you're using a constant in a bank of constants for that, so that everybody's referring to the same one. Maybe you're using hard-coded strings all over the place. We wanted that, again, to be something that was extremely obvious and very, very well-typed and things like that at compile time. So we created these Picklist enums. And so we'll go ahead and start with that one. So a Picklist enum looks like this. You just extend Picklist enum. Let's jump down to the constructor. You actually construct it off of the constant for the field itself, and it goes and reads all the metadata about it. It reads the values, it reads whether each one of the constants is active or not active, whether it's the default value, the string label, things like that, and makes those available. You do have to create your constants here. You just use value of. You create your constants to be referred to. I can't generate those at runtime based on the metadata. So those become they become a fixture of this type. And then because there are no custom parameterized types, you actually have to go implement some of these class methods that allow you to do things like get all the values for this enum, or give me the value for this well-known name. That's boilerplate. I wish we could avoid that, but without having type parameterization on custom types, I can't avoid that. So you have to just have that boilerplate every time. And this is what it looks like in practice when you're using it. You can just go out and use it. It looks very similar to using an enum type. Give me all the values. They come back. The one that's marked as default, if there is one, is automatically moved to the first. Really handy for doing things like creating a drop-down off of this, things like that. You can iterate across those. Each entry is actually an inner class, Picklist enum.entry, and then you can pull the metadata-based information off of it. It took care of all that for you. What is the symbolic value? What is the user-facing label? Is this an active entry? And is it the default value? And you can also do all types of strongly typed comparisons. You can go out and say, is this symbolic constant equal to this value I just pulled off of this object? Is it not equal to? You can even do, it also has ones that are like matches any, matches none. Is it in this set effectively? So really easy to work with in a strongly typed way with Picklist fields in Apex. And on the type-safe enum side, again, there's two reasons I would say that you would typically do this. One is there's another way that you can get a constrained domain of values out of the database in a common way, and that's formula fields. Very often you have a formula field that evaluates to one of a set of values. For example, a stoplight, red, blue, or red, green, yellow, things like that. Or high, medium, low, whatever it happens to be, something that scores. The other way is if you just actually would have normally used an Apex enum, but you wanted some other fields on that enum for each of the constants, you can't do that. So those would be the two use cases for this. And so this would be one where, for example, you have a formula field that's a computed score, and it will generate the strings high, medium, low, and you want to actually tag those with, say, a static resource image in a static resource bundle that you want to show alongside it and encapsulate that. So that's exactly what we've done here. And so you effectively have a type-safe enum. It constructs off of this class and the value for it. And if you look at the implementation, that's just the way that we make these available, kind of as a hierarchy in Apex, without type parameters. And then you put any other data that you want in it, just like you will with a class. And then you do have to do these boilerplates to be able to get all the values and index of, exactly like you did with Picklist and Enum. And then you can use it like this. You basically go out and say, give me all the values, iterate across them. I want to get the value. That's a symbolic name that you had. It computes an ordinal based on the order of declaration, top down for you, and whatever other data you had in there. Here's the image path. Whenever the value is high, it's going to return the high image. And then you can do the same types of strongly typed comparisons when you're evaluating whether whether a provided value matches an expected value, or doesn't, or falls into a set, whatever it happens to be. All right, so those are some of the enums. The last thing I want to go over is a logging wrapper. So again, the folks that I work with, we have a strong background in Java. And in Java, while there are several different implementations of this, the logging frameworks generally converge on some very similar interfaces. Things like Log4j and simple logging for Java and commons logging and things like that. And what we wanted was a facade over system.debug that looked like that for a couple of reasons. One is, if you want to log at different levels with system.debug, you have to go and add a logging level as your first parameter. And to me, it gets in the way of trying to understand what it is you're trying to express as you're logging. The other is that if you want to actually do any complex logging, you have to just go use string concatenation. And frankly, I strongly prefer using embedded formatting specifiers because it's a lot easier to maintain if you want to insert something in the middle, things like that. You don't have to go find all your pluses and align them or reformat your code. And I just prefer doing that. So that's one of the other things. There are overloads. So basically, this contains methods. The loggers contain methods for all the channels. So you have info, warn, debug, whatever it happens to be, error. And for each one of those, the first parameter is always the message. And then it has overloads for between 0 and 9. That's what string.format will actually handle for the formatting specifiers that you have. So you don't have to pass an array. You don't have to do new list and have all that. Just however many commas you want, just keep stringing them out there, just like you see here, up to 9 additional. Makes it really, really nice to do your logging. One thing I will point out, the guy on our team that implemented this, implemented it so that it actually has a pluggable backend. The default implementation is against system.debug. We would love to be able to log to an external logging facility like Elk or Splunk. Yeah, I know you do too, because we had these discussions a lot. There are a lot of restrictions in Salesforce that make that difficult. You can't do call-outs once there's pending DML. You can't do DML once you've done a call. There's all these types of things, right? I'm sorry, you can do call-outs with pending DML. You can't do the opposite. But there are all these things that get in the way. And I'm hoping platform events might help with this in the future. We would love to put another implementation up there that used platform events and allowed you to send messages off somewhere. So that you could do federated logging from Salesforce. Be outstanding. Especially as an ISV where we can't even get real logs out of our installed managed packages. So this is what it looks like. I mean, same thing you would expect if you were doing this in Java. You just do a logger.get instance, you give it a class constant. That will actually be included in the log statement, so you can go and filter by what came out of this particular class, things like that. And then you can log at different levels, log.info, log.warn, log.error, obviously log.debug. And you can see that you can use embedded formatting specifiers to put together your messages. Works really well. All right, so those are the contents of it right now. It's, it has quite a bit in there, but it will almost certainly grow over time. So let's talk about what's next. One thing you didn't see there is you didn't see namespaces on anything. And that means that if you already have classes with this name, it may become an issue adopting it. Maybe it replaces what you have, maybe you have to rename it, whatever it happens to be. I do want to package it. I don't want to create a managed package for it. Not a first generation managed package. We're at the end of those and those have such a weight to them. I really don't want to go at this point in time in my life and go do that. I also don't want to do the pseudo namespace in the beginning of it. I understand why people do that, but we're so close to second generation unlocked packages being ready for this type of distribution. I'm in a bit of a waiting game. So right now, I would prefer to wait and not go throw something out there that 6 months from now I'm going to go throw away and change. People have to go update things. So I do plan to have this be a package distribution model. I'm waiting for the right way to do that, the way that Salesforce says should be the mechanism for open source third-party libraries. Sirono is going to continue to be the moderator and primary contributor. We have a few things that we're already thinking about putting in there. One of them is we have a nightly data processing that has to happen, like I imagine a lot of you do. And we have to go through a series of operations, and if one fails, it may prohibit execution of one downstream, things like that. We have to have reporting, we have to have robustness. It has to happen async because we need higher limits, and we have to be able to batch things. So we built basically an async linear workflow orchestration framework, and I think it would be really useful for other people that have to do nightly data processing in volume in Salesforce. It's based completely on queuables, but it abstracts a lot of that away. It uses metadata. You actually use custom metadata types to go and define your workflow definition and the activities within it, and it actually logs everything as S objects that you can go and you can see it actually execute. This will be a really good thing to add. There's some work that would have to happen there because for one thing, it would be the first time that we actually add S objects to this in custom metadata. As far as other contributors, it's in GitHub. There's a public issue tracker. We welcome input. If you find bugs, absolutely let us know about them. If you have ideas on what could be improved, let us know about it. Throw that in there. Pull requests are absolutely encouraged. We'd love to see people send things over. Now, having said that, I want to be clear that when we look at it, we'll decide what the right disposition is. We are going to be judicious about what we put in this library. We don't want it to become just a dumping ground for ideas that we had. We want there to be very well-defined themes and consistent patterns across it and things like that, and things that are not very domain-specific. More of just like, again, a common library. So if we're going to be judicious about that for ourselves, we're going to be judicious about pull requests that we accept from folks. A bug fix almost certainly would just get merged. An enhancement, we'd look at it. If it fits the naming conventions and design patterns that are in place, probably be merged. If it doesn't, we might adapt it slightly to fit those and go ahead and merge it. If it's something we probably wouldn't accept ourselves if we were to write it, we would probably discuss that with whoever the person that opened the pull request was and see what the right way to proceed. It may mean a different library. Don't know. But the point is we would love to have community contribution to this. I think that's the whole point of this type of stuff, is to get the masses working on things together. So, am I 1 minute 53 over now? I'm going to keep going. Questions? Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, criticisms?
I read that there's you got a lightweight trigger handle, but I missed that part.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, does it support with FFlib, you can use application class to lock it fairly easily on the domain class, selectors and services. Does your handler get into that, or is it?
It's by design extremely lightweight, and it pushes off some stuff. Now, having said that, we use mocks in our testing. Because it forces you to get out of the trigger and into Apex immediately, the structuring of that Apex certainly lends itself to going in. If you're using an abstraction layer to access things, like a service layer or something like that, then you can certainly throw mocks in place. That's what we do. We basically have services, and the services have DAOs, and we have the ability to mock either layer. And so once we get into the business logic of the trigger, if we want to, we can swap out the services or the DAOs as appropriate with mocks and go and execute our tests like that. But it is not a first-class consideration of the library. It is intended to be very lightweight and just provide you a way to get from trigger.blah into actual Apex code executing on strongly typed collections. Yeah.
Is there anything to do with recursion?
I'm sorry?
The trigger handler, is there anything that
Trigger recursion?
Yeah.
No, there's no recursion guard in this. We have some of that in our intermediate-based class, and we've talked about, right now there's 2 or 3 different concepts in that, and they wouldn't all go here. We're thinking about splitting that out and either pulling it up into this, or more likely putting it into a recursive trigger handler that you can use recursion guards. But yeah, we have it, we just need to move it. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, we could include a field security check. Field level security check.
Field level security check. Maybe.
I mean, that one, is kind of common usage, right? I mean, it's a common use case. Everyone needs it.
It is. The reason I say maybe is some of the Apex features that are coming up that help with that. There's one that, I don't know if you've seen them, but there's one that you're going to be able to express in SOQL, but it's very binary, basically with security enforced, I believe. And if the fields you requested are not valid for the user, it'll actually throw an exception. That's not going to be very useful to people. There's a new feature coming up, probably 2 releases from now. I probably shouldn't speak for Chris, he'll kill me for saying that, but coming up soon, where you'll be able to go out and run, and then you'll be able to say, basically strip inaccessible fields right after that. I don't really feel like at this point being that close to that, going and adding field level security, because to get to that you have to do dynamic SOQL generation and things like that. They're about to give us something that's going to allow you to use static SOQL queries and strip the object down to the things that are accessible to the user. I feel like, again, it's a waiting game. So the answer is no, but that's the long-winded way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, AD has framework for that use.
Absolutely.
Now you work for Salesforce. I assume you might want to put a huge library into the framework or something.
And Chris came from Financial Force as well, who's in charge of Apex now, and he's definitely addressing this in a different way. He's doing it as a more first-class thing, where it's part of the language and part of the library, rather than being part of an external framework. So it is coming, but we're not going to provide it because the language will have it within the next 6 months, hopefully. So, but that doesn't. I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of field level security. It's critical, right? Especially if you have dramatically different personae who, only some should have access to certain fields. That's critical. This only addresses CRUD right now. I would advise that you to look somewhere else if you need field level security, ideally in the language as soon as it has it. Nothing else? Yeah.
On the exception-based asserts, since you don't have lambdas, is the assumption that you would do a try, do your system under test, catch, and then use your exception assert after that?
Yeah, it would pretty much look like try, do something that should raise an exception, assert.fail if you got to the next line, right? Because if you got the next line, you're in an invalid state. Catch, say DML exception, assert.has DML exception, and if, for example, if you expect it on a field, say something like contact.name. I don't know why somebody's name would be invalid, but contact.name, comma, the exception. Yeah, so that's the way it would work. You probably noticed in here, with the lack of the ability to do inline ad hoc behavior functions, there are a lot of things in here that give you the ability to do pseudo-functional programming, at least kind of canned. All the slicers and things like that are things you would normally do in a stream or something like that in Java. We just went and got the most common behaviors that we saw, and we just provided them. So, but that's exactly how it would work in the absence of anonymous interclasses and such. The comparators are going to really benefit out of this from anonymous interclasses, because you can just create a comparator at the point of use that solves exactly that problem. That's the main thing in here that would benefit from it, but anonymous interclasses are going to open up a whole swath of better design. Let me say that.
One example where you sorted twice, you sorted first by name and then nulls first, is that you are sorting twice. Basically, going to sort the first time, and then the result of that, you're going to resort.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you are. No, I'm sorry. No, you're not. It's you're comparing each element twice, each pair of elements twice. You're in a single sort. So if you're talking about the big O on it, it's no worse. Your operation that happens each time is compare last names. If they're different, you can return that value. Your now last name prevails. If they're the same, if that comes back with 0, compare first names and return the value of that. So you're doing 2 comparisons per operation, but your total number of operations is still going to be according to the sort algorithm. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
For ISV, how ISV can adopt or use your framework here?
Yeah, so that was kind of what I was referring to at the end. In a perfect world, I would just put a package out there and you go and install that package as a dependency of yours. Are you talking about as far as security review? Yeah, and it's not a package right now, so you would have to, you'd have to grab it and put it into your code, and then somehow, and to make it available to you, and then you would have to, if you're an ISV and you're doing managed packages, it would either need to be in your package, in which case it would go through your review, just like it would if you're using fflib or something like that, or Apex Lang or something like that, or you would need to deploy it as just unpackaged code, just raw code, and you could refer to it. Having said that, that's why I want to have a namespaced unlocked package that you put in as a dependency of yours. And this is one of the things I've been talking to Delete Berkey, who's in charge of packaging, and some of these folks, is what is and Andy actually, what is your strategy for invigorating this open source community? It's been severely lacking forever in Salesforce, and you almost have the mechanisms to allow it. But if you go out and say that every single open source library has to pass security review, it's going to stifle that. So my understanding, let me qualify this a couple different ways because I'll probably be wrong. My understanding is that something akin to namespaced unlocked second generation packages are going to be a mechanism for doing that, and they're still trying to decide what it means in terms of security review and stuff like that, because ultimately it becomes a dependency of your product. For you to pass security review, that needs to be considered secure. So you can't just ignore the fact that it's there, because it's going to be in the org that you give to the security review team and all that. So I want to talk to them about where that's going with packaging, and the answer to your question would come out of that. But I mean, the only answer I have right now is you just have to include this in your package when you submit it to security review.
Then who will be the license issue though? I mean, you said everything including my package, and would it be any kind of license issue?
No, this is distributed under Apache 2.0, and Apache 2.0 basically says you can use it however you want. You have to include the license with it, right? Include it however you want. We get no claims to what you have. You don't automatically own it either, things like that. It's the same license that's used. You know, there's a couple of these MIT that aren't GPL. They're not the ones that basically say we own you now. It was very carefully selected for that, so it shouldn't do any license imposition on you or on me. What it does, though, is it means that for security review, you own that. We had a similar thing with these guys. I worked with them until a year ago. We had a similar thing when we used Apex Lang. And we had to go out and we basically, Apex Lang had already passed security review, but this team over here looked at it when we submitted it, and they didn't like something in it and failed us. I was like, wait, it passed. But they didn't like it because there was a place where they were logging an entire object that could have some sensitive information. And they're like, so that's fine. I went and commented that out and it passed. But I didn't go back to Richard Van Hook and say, hey man, your stuff failed. The onus was on me at that point. I want to take that away with the correct packaging strategy, but I don't know 100% what that's going to be because second generation packaging is not baked 100% yet. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
So until second generation comes on board, what do you think the most efficient way to get these types of programs into scratch org would be?
To get them into scratch orgs?
Yeah.
What I would do is, you know how you can set up your package directories in your SFTX project.json? Put them in a separate directory and add that as a package directory, and whenever you do a push, it'll push them into your scratch org.
So download on file every time.
Yeah, you could use a Git submodule.
Yeah.
I don't know if you use Git, but you could use a Git submodule. That's actually what we're doing. We put it in because we want to, you know, eat our own dog food, right? So we basically have a Git submodule under our main project, and it's this. It's just this checked out on one of our own branches, and it just gets deployed with our stuff. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Again, thank you all for making the trek up here. I appreciate it. So.